And I am reading from, this is Reverend Dr. Nadine Rosechild-Sullivan, and I'm reading from my book, An Abomination in the Sight of the Lord, a deeper look at the Jewish and Christian scriptures thought to condemn homosexuality. I'm going to read this time the little bit of the beginning and a little bit of the end. So the beginning part, beginning on page 5, is called Why This Matters, or It's Important to Know, and That's Why I'm Bothering Telling You So, to steal a little from Dr. Seuss. The Bible is one of the major underpinnings of Western culture. It has been used across millennia to justify great good and, unfortunately, great horror. Within its pages, there is a wealth of wisdom. It offers proverbs, spiritual comfort, stories of and metaphors for freedom and deliverance. And in the King James Version, lilting Elizabethan-style poetry and prose, all of which have had an impact upon our Western culture. A broad knowledge of its text provides part of a cultural education that cannot be obtained by other means. And those who believe in the divine inspiration of its text believe that within its pages they find access to salvation, access to the mind of the Godhead. But as an influential collection of ancient writings, it also has had negative effects, both upon our history and upon our present. One of the most devastatingly negative influences that has come down to us through its pages is the concept found in the book of Genesis of subduing the earth. A concept that has been misused until the earth has been subdued in more ways and with more rigor than the earth or its fragile dependent species can manifestly bear. Another is the use of Bible texts to justify genocide. One example of this is the use of the Bible to justify the murder of multiple millions across the continent of Europe of Christians on the grounds of heresy, and of non-Christian followers of the old religion on the grounds of trumped-up charges of a largely imagined satanic, air quotes, satanic witchcraft, and the consequent theft of their lands and possessions under the Inquisition, circa 1184 to 1833. The year 1184 to the year 1833 is actually the length of the Inquisition, the length of killing people for being pagan or using the old religion or Wiccan or witches or whatever. So a lot of years. Another example is the use of the Bible to justify the genocide by massacre and the removal of survivors by forced death marches and by forced resettlement of the multiple millions of indigenous inhabitants of the lands now known as the Americas and their surrounding islands, and to justify the theft and continued occupation of their ancestral homelands, and even now of the ongoing co-optation and dismantling of their surviving cultures under the papal doctrine of discovery and the misshapen theology of manifest destiny from 1492 to the present. So Native Americans, First Nations peoples, and the indigenous peoples of South America and Central America as well. Another is the use of the Bible to justify the enslavement of multiple millions of human beings, including the particular race-based slavery of the African diaspora, beginning in 1442 to circa 1865, with its kidnapping, forced transport, decimation of family and tribal groups, institutionalized rape, physical brutality, and forced labor, and its continuing aftermath of individual and institutional racism, embedded structural inequity, and race-based, state-sponsored violence and mass imprisonment from 1865 to the present. I'm reading this on July 4th, 2020. And still another is the use of the Bible to justify the subordination and cloistering of fully adult female human beings within a guardianship system, the historic traditional structure of families and marriages in Western culture circa 1300 BC to 1920 AD, and to limit their participation in the public spheres of power. of business, of education, of government, the state, and of religion, the church, synagogue, mosque, temple, or other religious hierarchy or congregation from circa 2000 BC to the present. So the subjugation of women in Western cultures. But in discussion here will be the use of the Bible to justify the hatred and silencing of and acts of discrimination against those who are different in regard to sexual orientation and or gender identity and expression. This book will address the use of the Bible against this last group, people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, transgender, or gender nonconforming, also known as LGBT+, with a more particular focus on sexual orientation than on gender identity, as historically that has been the more particular use made of the Bible text. Religion has played and continues to play a huge role in the suffering of LGBT+ people, yet not approving or understanding LGBT+ people does not make them go away. And I'm skipping the body of the book to move to two afterwords. One is called For Those Who Are Not Christian, and another is an afterword for those who are Christian. So the afterword for those who are not Christian, beginning on page 217, it's short. For my readers who are of other faith traditions or who are agnostic, atheist, or in some other way outside of a faith tradition, I will take a moment here to reiterate both the good and the harm that come to people as groups and as individuals from their faith traditions. There are a number of mysteries to life: why we are here, where we are going, and where those we have loved but who have left here before us have gone. Whether you count it as real or imagined, faith can be a great comfort in the face of these questions of purpose and death. And simply pursuing the questions has a fascination of its own. Yet the religions humankind has developed, for all the comfort they can provide in sorrow, and the rituals they lend us for times of joy, can also harm us each in their own way. Within the Jewish/Christian tradition, there have been and are, and I recognize there's a lot of diversity within those traditions and multiple layers. There have been and are wonderful leaders who have and do step forward for kindness and justice. There have also been those who, convinced of the translation and their interpretive understanding of the text they hold in their hand, have used the Hebrew and Christian scriptures as a bludgeon of oppression against women, against sexual minorities, against racial minorities, to keep some poor, to make others rich, by justifying exploitation, to justify decimating and perhaps irrevocably damaging the earth. And seen in this very study, the Bible, and more broadly religion, has been used to sound the clarion call for genocide, first in Canaan, later to light the fires of the Inquisition and subjugate the indigenous religions of the European continent, then to theorize the manifest destiny of the conquerors against the indigenous peoples of the now Americas and around the globe, leaving more dead and immiserated than we have yet begun to imagine. To justify the enslavement and transport of millions and millions of Africans, scattering them around the globe in impoverished and subjugated ways, decimating the continent they came from and enriching the few who profited from the plantations on the land masses they were carried to, and in ongoing massacres and genocides encircling our planet. One piece of this misuse of spirituality, of human wonder about the mysteries of where we come from, why we're here, and where we go, has been the use of these 7 Bible sections against those who do not or often cannot conform to the majority in matters of sexual, affectional orientation and or gender identity. These 7 slam scriptures, I wrote about them through the book, have been taken out of their context, loosed of the logic of their moorings, and thrust and jabbed into human hearts and families for far, far too long. It is time, like the verses justifying slavery, that we stop using them this way. One of the early leaders of the movement for women for gender equality, let me do that again. One of the early leaders of the movement of women for gender equality, a thinker and writer by the name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, came to recognize that no matter the equality women won in the political sphere or the gains they made in the public sphere beyond the home, that even if governments amended their political constitutions, for example, to give women the vote and women won public office, as long as the King James Version remained unamended, women would never be free. Even so, until we stop using the Bible to justify harming each other, gay, LGBT plus people, women, people of color, adherents of faiths not our own, inhabitants of lands or possessions we want to steal, and more will still be harmed and divested of their human rights and ability to pursue happiness in the name of this deity. There is work to do, and work being done in Christianity and in other faith traditions as well. Within Christianity, each denomination has its own hierarchically approved or lay-led hierarchically unapproved gay or LGBT plus affirming group, the United Church of Christ, approved LGBT plus individuals to the full life of the church, all of the sacraments, including ordination in the 1970s, and encouraged their congregations to go through the process of becoming open and affirming. Unitarian Universalists did the same and have a process for congregations to become welcoming. Quakers are generally affirming. The Episcopalian Church, though not the entire Anglican Communion, has come a long way at the price of threatened global schism. Other denominations struggle on, and so do their lay-led groups. Dignity for the Roman Catholics more like Presbyterians, affirming and reconciling ministries Methodist, evangelicals concerned, and the list goes on. And whatever your faith or perspective, it remains important to know what a book that has so influenced Western culture for good and ill does and does not say, and to understand its ongoing impact on the people and groups of people around you. And now, just briefly, the afterword, it's not long, for those who are Christian. So page 221, for those who are Christian. I want to acknowledge your concern for your own spiritual well-being and for the spiritual well-being of a loved one, family member, or friend. Within an orthodox theology, one that holds the inerrancy of Scripture, the virgin birth, and the substitutionary death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, it is still possible to affirm LGBT plus people and to include them in the full life of the church, including all of the sacraments. Those with a desire to testify against homosexuality often do so out of a desire to circumvent what they perceive to be their imminent danger of eternal jeopardy. Evangelical Christianity often frames its preaching against sin with the metaphor that if you were passing by and saw someone in the window of a house and their house were on fire and they appeared not to know, that it would be ethically wrong to fail to tell them that their house was on fire. It is, indeed, more loving to warn someone of imminent danger that they could avoid than it is to fail to warn them. The metaphor and the impetus to warn or preach against homosexuality both fall apart when one realizes that the Scripture does not say that homosexuality or gender nonconformity are sin. Lack of knowledge of ancient histories and cultures and the limitations of the translations of those verses used to condemn same-sex oriented and gender nonconforming people has led the church to take a stand that unnecessarily causes harm to same-sex oriented, gender nonconforming human beings. Their house is not on fire, at least not in regard to their sexual orientation or gender identity and presentation. It is clear that Jesus said, "Judge not, lest you be judged," and that if you love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself, you fulfill the whole of the law and the prophets, the whole of the Hebrew scriptures, to which he adds, "Do this, and you shall live." In its original text, the Bible neither addresses nor condemns loving, committed, same-sex intimate relationships. All of Scripture, and most notably Jesus, is silent on the issue. And so I place before you today the thought that where Christ has neither spoken nor condemned, neither should the church. A primary principle of Bible interpretation is context. If we do not hold to understanding individual verses within the context of the discourse they are part of, if we cherry pick, we can make almost any verse mean almost anything we want it to. This practice is called proof texting. In closing, 7 references hardly constitute a major theme of Scripture. Themes such as helping the oppressed and salvation by faith, not works, are addressed hundreds of times. Therefore, even if you choose not to address this issue by the solid exegesis of the original text and instead maintain your limited English-only theology, remaining convinced that that Scripture defines same-sex intimate contact as sin, it is important that you recognize that homosexuality, if it were found to be sin, is clearly not unforgivable. No Christian has any cause to treat a homosexual believer worse than they would treat a Christian single who has fallen into premarital sex. Such flawed and human believers generally such flawed and human believers generally do not receive letters from their pastors warning them of their ultimate condemnation to hell. Rather, with them, the church labors, praying, counseling, extending patience, honoring their privacy, standing with them through the years as they battle the weaknesses of their flesh. Having done the work of looking carefully at the scriptures in their original tongues, and having concluded that homosexuality is not defined by Scripture as a sin in the eyes of God, it is clear to me that homosexual Christians can live holy and righteous lives in God's sight as they express their sexuality within the same kinds of moral limits that would be applied to heterosexuals and heterosexual unions. We should extend the same courtesy and agape love of God to same-sex attracted and gender non-conforming individuals as we would to any other believer. As you seek God's truth on this issue, I ask that you prayerfully consider this scripture exegesis. Thank you.